Hello, I'm Tanya Verkaitis, the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Pennsylvania. Welcome to our first webinar for 2022. This is our new format, so we'll be doing lunch and learns for the rest of the year. As always, we'll have a recording on the website, and you can also view the Facebook Live version. Today, we're doing waste coal and cryptocurrency in Pennsylvania, which is going to be presented by Rob Altenburg. He's the Senior Director for Energy and Climate at PennFuture and has been working in this arena for over 30 years. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please feel free to put comments and links in the chat. If possible, please use Q&A for questions that you'd like to be answered by Rob. That way I can make sure that I see them. Also, if you have any questions or suggestions for PSRPA, please send them to info@PSRPA. I'll also put that in the chat. And as you can see on this slide, our next webinar will be March 11th, and it is on fossil fuel companies' increasing use of trade agreements to attack climate initiatives. With that, I'll hand it over to Rob.
And there we go. So Bitcoin and fossil fuels in Pennsylvania, Bitcoin are primarily waste coal. A lot of people have probably heard about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in the news. And one of the reasons why people have probably heard about it is this that we see here. There's a lot of money right now in the Bitcoin market. If you take all of the Bitcoin that are out there in circulation with the current market value, its market capitalization would be equal to all but the very largest corporations in the world. There's certainly some questions about how real that is. We hear about people talking about Bitcoin as a fake internet money. Is there really anything of value there? And there's a bigger question that we're probably not going to answer here today, and that's how money works and what the value is of money. I mean, there's people that can use things like the Ray stones in Palau. Almost anything could be used as money if people can exchange it, and if people recognize it has value. And Bitcoin is certainly. People are exchanging it, a lot of currency speculation, but people are exchanging it and using it like money. Officially, the IRS calls it property. The Securities and Exchange Commission is certainly aware that this thing is out there. Their regulations are not really well settled on how to consider Bitcoin, but there is a market for it, and in that way, it's very real. So why Bitcoin? Why is there a market for it? The history of Bitcoin is a little bit of a mystery. It started with a paper written by somebody who went by the pen name of Satoshi Nakamoto. We do not know who Satoshi was. There's a lot online of trying to narrow down who this person is. But what Satoshi said in the paper is the purpose was to overcome this problem of trust, where if you have a credit card transaction, you require a trusted third party, a credit card company, and that credit card company prices in their profit into your transaction. And they also add in pricing to account for fraud and account for all these other things, and that raises the cost of transactions. They also, to protect themselves, and to defeat fraud, they also require personal information to be shared. And so it's not anonymous in the way cash can be anonymous. So Satoshi had this idea that we could replace all of that with this cryptographic proof. And it's what this paper describes is generically, we talk about it as cryptocurrency. We talk about it as blockchain technology. Those are similar words, or Bitcoin itself is the coin. Now, Bitcoin and blockchain aren't the same thing, but they are related, and we'll talk about how. This starts off, we're not going to get too technical in this presentation, but the fundamental technology behind Bitcoin is really based on this idea from cryptographic security. It's called hashing, but it's really just fingerprinting. So you could take any block of data you could store in a computer, you could run it through something called a hash, and you could get a unique fingerprint for that data. This number here, that is, I took an entire copy of War and Peace, I ran it through the hash algorithm, and that's the number. The number's in base 16 hexadecimal, written out in decimal, how you're used to seeing it. It's a very large number, but anytime I would run War and Peace through this hashing algorithm, I get that exact same number. If I change one period to a comma, that number becomes completely different. That set of data that I ran through has a unique fingerprint, and that unique fingerprint is the hash. And this is used, we use this really all the time without knowing about it on our computers for secure transactions with your bank, any secure viewing of the web, digital signatures, all kinds of things use this fingerprinting mechanism. And it's kind of useful if you had, for example, financial data, you could fingerprint the financial data and you could know if it was changed. Just by itself, though, that could be challenging. If your accountant fingerprinted the data, every time they added something to the ledger, you'd have as many fingerprints as you had ledger entries, and that wouldn't make a lot of sense. So we use a thing called a blockchain. And what we do is we have a block of data, we create a fingerprint for that block of data, and we include that fingerprint in the next block of data. So it's the fingerprints that link all these blocks together. What this means is we can have this ledger of, in this case, financial transactions, but it really could be most anything. We have this ledger that can go back years and years. But if anybody would go in and change one number in the ledger, the fingerprints wouldn't match, and it would be instantly obvious that this had been changed. And that's really what's handy about this blockchain. It's a way that you can create a public database that everybody can have a copy of it. You can share it all over. Really, anybody could theoretically add to it, but you can never delete anything and you can never change anything. You can only add. So you create this, it's creating a permanent record that you can share online. And this permanent record does not require a Google, a Microsoft, or anybody, or an Apple computer to manage it, or any government. So this is blockchain, and these are actually fairly useful. There's a lot of interesting things that you can do with this. The problem, though, is how you create a new block to this blockchain. You've got to find some way that, one, you don't create too many blocks because you don't want to have like 1 million blocks every second. But you also have to have a way that everybody can agree when a block is created. And this creating the block, this is the process that we call mining. So what Satoshi put in his Bitcoin paper is fairly, it's actually a fairly simple procedure, although I think on this graphic, it looks less simple, is you take a bunch of information, header information, that fingerprint from the last block, the time, date, version number, all of that kind of thing. The list of transactions that you want to include in that block. These are pulled from a thing called a mempool, which is just a group of pending transactions that people post online. And then you hash that block. And if that was all there was to it, people would be creating blocks thousands of times a second. So the system has a way to rate limit to create blocks only about 10 minutes, once every 10 minutes. And how it does this rate limiting is it includes this concept of difficulty, where not just any hash works. You have to find a block of data that has a hash that's a low number. And how low depends on how many people are trying to do this. So the more people that try to mine Bitcoin, the harder it becomes to mine Bitcoin, to mine new blocks, the harder it becomes. So, if your chance of winning the Powerball is, almost 300,000, very unlikely, but, there's that chance of winning. If you tried to say, well, I'm going to just run this algorithm and see if I can mine a new Bitcoin block, your chances are much, much lower. Now, when you mine a block, Bitcoin is the reward. You get Bitcoin for mining a block. And that's what's driving this. But the chances are very, very low. This whole concept is called proof of work. And it ends up being wasteful by design, because what happens is to increase your odds of successfully mining a block, successfully creating new Bitcoin, you try hundreds of trillions of times a second. You make guesses and attempts and try to be the first one that guesses it right. When Bitcoin was first created, you could run a program on your desktop computer and maybe you'd mine a Bitcoin. These days, miners use special purpose hardware known as ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits, that run literally hundreds of trillions of these hashing calculations every second. And miners use hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of these mining boxes. This particular one that I have the picture is not the very top of the line today. It was really top of the line this past summer, still fairly, fairly current, used box. This individual box, a little bigger than a shoebox, uses more electricity than the average than three average Pennsylvania households. They run 24/7, all of the time. So, what is it that's driving the miners to do this? Again, Bitcoin is the reward for mining a block. This is yesterday when I was updating my slides, I checked what the latest block stats were, and the miner that mined that block got 6.25 Bitcoin worth almost $300,000 plus transaction fees. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially for being successful. So it incentivizes people to spend lots and lots of money on energy and hardware to try and win this race and try to be the one that mines Bitcoin. And this is happening really all over the world. There's news that China, for example, is not mining anymore. They're still making the mining hardware. All the mining hardware is made there. But really all over the world, United States, Russia, a lot of places in Europe are doing this mining. The network overall, all of this effort mining Bitcoin, it takes about 14 gigawatts of power. It takes more energy there's more energy going into mining Bitcoin than the entire state of New York consumes. If Bitcoin mining was compared to countries' consumptions, it would be like Sweden or Malaysia. Just a tremendous amount of energy. For each block that is mined, the network uses more energy than the average Pennsylvania household uses in 40 years. So it is a tremendous amount of energy that goes into doing this. And the energy is essentially wasted. All it is doing is guessing and guessing and guessing and guessing, hoping to be the one that finds that low hash number, that mines the block, that gets the reward. And all the wrong guesses are thrown away. There's no other value that comes out of that. It's not like it's solving any in-depth science problems or anything like that. They're just throwing it away, starting over with the next, 10 minutes later, they start from scratch and try to continue mining. So yeah, tremendous amount of energy gets sucked into this process. So where's the energy coming from? Well, in Pennsylvania, there's a few different sources now, but there is some of it coming from waste coal. Now, waste coal, this is back 1900, around there, really up until really into the 60s and 70s, when mines dug up rocks that had a little bit of coal in them, but not a lot. They're low energy value, things that they couldn't sell. They just dumped. They dumped it in piles. And we have literally billions of tons of these coal piles. It's also called comb and bony and gob and lots of other things. But we have billions of tons of these piles scattered around the state. The rainwater on these, it leaches through them. It drains out into our streams. It's effectively acid mine drainage. It'll turn streams orange, kill all of the life in the stream. So really kind of nasty stuff. But there would be different ways that you could deal with this. If we could appropriate funds through the legislature or other sources to dig it up and move it to an appropriately lined, permitted landfill where it's not going to leach into the water, that would be great. In some cases, we could plant beach grasses or some other vegetation that would live on top of it. It would create a vegetation barrier that would encase it and stop or at least minimize the problem with this leaching. Not as good as having it someplace where it won't leach at all, but certainly better than the status quo. We could do that. But the solution that we've adopted in Pennsylvania since really the late 80s and early 90s is we've dug this stuff up, shipped it to power plants, and burnt it. Now, the claims that you will hear is burning it reduces pollution. Well, not really. Burning it moves pollution. We're taking pollution that was going into the land and water, and we're moving it into the air. And as air pollution goes, waste coal facilities are probably the dirtiest, most polluting facilities we have in the state. They use coal-fired power plants are dirty and polluting in general. And these plants use low energy value coal. So for the same amount of energy, they've got to burn more. And that means more pollutants. So certainly carbon pollution that exacerbates the climate crisis is a big one, but acid gases, smog forming compounds, heavy metals, all manner of air toxics, all come out of these plants. And so we have these waste coal plants, and then we have a company, one particular company, Stronghold Digital Mining. They put up their S1, that was before they went for their initial public offering with the SEC. They filed an S1 report last summer and said what they're going to do is they buy the scrubgrass and Panther Creek plants, which they have since purchased. They own these plants, and possibly a third plant, which still may be in process. They said they were going to buy 57,000 of these Bitcoin miners, and they are going to take the energy from the waste coal plants to power these miners. And this would cause millions of tons of CO2 a year. But what they claimed and what they told investors is that they could mine a Bitcoin for $3,000, when a Bitcoin today sells for about $35,000, about $45,000. It varies a fair amount. It was $60,000 in November, December. But yeah, so thousands of percent profit doing this kind of thing. But mining for $3,000 per Bitcoin is really cheap for energy costs. And the question is, how could somebody take low energy value coal that, these coal plants weren't profitable to start with, really. They were getting subsidized anyway just to run and not really competing well in the energy market. How could these suddenly become competitive in the Bitcoin market? And there's a lot of questions about that. A lot of, I think, very valid questions about that. But what Stronghold said, and this this is this graph that's up here shows what they call the levelized cost of energy. And the real takeaway from this graph is that coal is not the cheap source of energy. Certainly, renewables are often the cheapest. Gas, fracked gas particularly, is almost always cheaper than coal. And this is why Pennsylvania only has one large coal-fired power plant that has an announced retirement. So why are the Stronghold using expensive power to mine Bitcoin? Certainly dirty power, but why would they use expensive power? And what they're saying is, well, they're doing that because Pennsylvania ratepayers and taxpayers are heavily subsidizing it to the tune of about 60% of their energy costs. And those subsidies come in a lot of ways. One of the ways is we have a waste coal tax credit. We're up to $20 million that we pay these companies just for burning the stuff. But our legislature also recently, well, we have something called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards. In other states, they call it Renewable Portfolio Standards because they're about renewable energy, but here it's alternative because it has waste coal. So how our Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard works is it says that by last summer, 8% of our energy usage had to come from essentially clean sources. About 7.5% coming from mostly wind, and about 0.5% coming from solar photovoltaic. It also said 10% of our energy had to come from tier 2 sources. And tier 2 sources, waste coal is one of those. It used to be that tier 2 energy, what they call credit or that generation could come anywhere on our power grid. And that's North Carolina to Chicago, 13 states, plus the District of Columbia, a wide area. But our legislature changed that in the end of 2020 and said, no, those tier 2 credits have to come from Pennsylvania. And that really spiked these credit costs. So what Stronghold is saying is that essentially $16 for every megawatt hour of generation is coming from these credits that they're selling. So this is ratepayers paying for this. This adds to your electric bill, makes your electric bill higher, but that's what's funding them. Now, that was their plan last summer. They did go to an initial public offering. They sucked in over $130 million of investment. They finalized the purchase of these plants, bought a lot of miners. There's still third plant. They're not going to buy the one they thought they were going to buy, but they're still saying that they're going to buy 80,000 of these mining, now 80,000 up from 56,000 of these pieces of mining hardware. And that's going to require them buying another plant somewhere to put these. So far, they've been losing money, but with a $130 million IPO, they've got a good way. They're not shutting down anytime soon here with this level of investment, and they could easily really drive the amount of pollution that's coming from these facilities. Not just waste coal, though. We do have Bitcoin mining happening at the Susquehanna nuclear power plant. Not a tremendous amount compared to the size of the station, but we do have Bitcoin mining there. We've just now had reports where well site owners of fracked gas, this Haggerty well in particular near Coalport, Pennsylvania, are installing generators that they essentially plug into the gas well and use that to mine Bitcoin. Haggerty had about we think about 10 megawatts worth of generation on this little pad that's about a quarter mile square. So tiny little pad with 40 generating units sitting on this pad generating Bitcoin. There's also the real danger that some of these larger retiring coal plants are going to adopt Bitcoin mining to keep their plant in operation longer. We haven't seen that happen in Pennsylvania. We haven't seen reports of that in Pennsylvania yet, but there's certainly talk about it in West Virginia, some Appalachian states, Texas, and other places. And that could very easily happen here. So the question then is, what do we do? And Bitcoin, again, it's decentralized. There is no government that issues Bitcoin or is in charge of it. There's no single company that issues Bitcoin and is in charge of it. So it's very challenging to say, well, how do we solve this problem? It's challenging, but we can do things about it. I think one of the easiest ones is stop subsidizing pollution. We talk a lot about the polluter pays principle. The cost of pollution should be borne by the industry that's doing the polluting. Yes, they will pass the costs along to ratepayers, but that gives consumers a reasonable choice to say, well, I could, pay this company for dirty power, or I could take that money and I could invest in solar, or I could invest in some other clean energy or something else. As it is now, you don't necessarily have the choice. With things like the tax rebates, you can put solar on your roof, you're still paying tax rebates, transferable tax credits to companies that are polluting. And so stop subsidizing pollution is the big one. Educating potential investors is another one. This $130 million IPO that Stronghold did wasn't just a lot of people saying, I've heard about Bitcoin, I'm going to buy a Bitcoin, or I'm going to buy into this just to see what this is all about. This is institutional investing, and this is large scale investors that are pouring money into these transactions. So educating them certainly that there's the danger, the environmental dangers, there's companies, and we actually saw this with Tesla. Initially, Tesla Elon Musk was very pro Bitcoin until the public outcry of the environmental damage that Bitcoin was doing got out, and then he said, "Yeah, we're not going to be accepting Bitcoin for buying new Teslas anymore." There's certainly a lot of companies out there that have made environmental and sustainability targets and goals, and making sure that investors and people realize that this is not a sustainable investment is certainly worth doing. Educating policymakers. About 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago now, the US House of Representatives, the House Commerce Committee, had a hearing on Bitcoin. And the people they invited, they had some good speakers, but most of them were very, very pro-Bitcoin, doing a very typical sales pitch to legislators saying, well, burning fossil fuels to create this stuff is bringing jobs to my district, which it's really not. And there's very few jobs in this. But it's economic development, it's pollution, and pollution is jobs, and all of these other messages that they were giving. It's not the case, but our politicians are very easily swayed by that messaging. So it's very important to educate them that this is not just harmless stuff that's happening that can bring new jobs or new industry into your district. This has a lot of pollution associated with it. And that pollution has very real costs. Also, when you're taking energy and when you're trying to take cheap energy off the grid, that's raising everybody else's energy prices. That's energy that we could have been using for something else that's now essentially being wasted. So yeah, educating policymakers is important. Making sure permits are enforced. I had mentioned that one particular well site, Haggerty A, where they put 40 generators. They didn't get a permit for that. They're on wheels, they trucked them up and they plugged them in. Now, our Department of Environmental Protection has issued a notice of violation. That's still in process. We'll see where that ends up. But making sure that we actually enforce these permits and people aren't just plugging in these miners, increasing their pollution and profiting while we are experiencing the damage from the poor air quality because of this. And a larger thing, this would likely take a federal initiative as well, is to move away from what we call proof of work cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, we talked about this one method, this proof of work, where they have to guess hundreds of trillions, thousands of trillions of times every second, using tremendous amounts of energy to do that. And that guessing, it's just a waste. It doesn't do anything productive. It's just there. It's just there to slow down the rate that Bitcoiner created. But we don't need to do that. We can have blockchain technology. We can have cryptocurrency. We can do all of those things without this wasteful proof of work technology. There's other alternatives out there. They're actually being used that just aren't wasteful. And wasting energy is bad. It's something that we shouldn't be doing. So I talked for about half an hour. So I guess I will stop here and we can talk about questions. And one of the, I guess the first question I see on the list is somebody said, how can mining of something like China crypto be climate friendly? There really isn't a good way to make this climate friendly. We can use less energy than we're using now, using something other than the proof of work technology. There's proof of stake and there's other alternatives out there that use a whole lot less energy. It's always going to use, it's always going to use a certain amount of energy. So yeah, there's no particular, totally climate friendly way of doing it. There have been projects that people have suggested using blockchain technology, more than just creating cryptocurrency, to do things like be able to trade solar energy without utilities having to be middlemen and things like that, that could make renewable energy cheaper and things like that. That kind of stuff is a possible positive that you could use with this technology. But yeah, it's energy consumption. And another question is, are the mining farms popping up in West Virginia for Bitcoin or for cryptocurrency? In other words, are they specifically for Bitcoin? Most of the mining operations are for Bitcoin because it was the first out of the gate and is currently really by far the most valuable at $45,000 per Bitcoin. So most of the operations are doing that, but there definitely are, there's hundreds of coins out there. Generically, we talk about altcoins. And there's hundreds of other coins. There's hundreds of other blockchains out there. Not all of them have this problem that Bitcoin has that are wasteful, just by their very design. There's big companies like IBM manages their own blockchain for some projects. So yes, there are alternatives out there. I wasn't looking at the chat.
I wanted to ask Rob, you talked about alternative coins that are out there. So the person who's mining in their home, we're not as worried about them as these companies that are buying coal plants, for instance. Or is that an issue as well?
Well, I mean, any time that, well, very few people are actually mining in their home just because of the expense of the hardware and everything like that. If you're using power from the grid, you're using a lot of fossil fuel power right now to mine. And that is great. That is contributing to pollution. It's small compared to what one of these dedicated mining companies is generating, but it is still contributing to the problem out there. It's I guess, theoretically possible to mine these things using clean generation like solar. It very rarely happens. And one of the reasons is if you buy an individual Bitcoin mining box, that one, you'll spend about $5,000 for that. You would need a fairly decent sized solar array, certainly bigger than I have, to actually make use of that box. And solar runs at a lower capacity factor, so you could not run it 24/7. These boxes, they have a useful life of about 18 months before the technology passes them by and they're really not worth running anymore. After that, they become e-waste. So what we find the companies are doing is they want to run, once they buy them, they want to run them as much and as fast as possible to recoup their investment. And that tends not to be using wind or solar or a variable renewable energy. They tend to gravitate to the fossil fuels.
Also, as an individual, would investing in these cryptocurrencies, be detrimental? I think a lot of us may have invested in the early years, and now we question whether or not we should keep those investments.
Well, so assuming somebody like holds a Bitcoin or a fraction of a Bitcoin today, any transaction that's made with that Bitcoin requires a new block to be added to the chain. It requires this huge commitment of energy. So, certainly by investing in these, by holding these, it's contributing to the value, the market value. It's bringing in new investors, so people can buy this mining hardware. So yeah, there is, I think, significant ethical issues with having and holding these coins. I think there's also financial issues. I had a slide at the very beginning about the tulips, tulip mania, if people remember from history in the 1600s, the Dutch would sell individual tulip bulbs for far more than the average person's annual salary. And it was a speculative bubble in the market that there was nothing to it. There was no inherent value. If Warren Buffett, for example, has talked about Bitcoin, saying, yeah, when you buy a Bitcoin, you don't buy anything. It doesn't make anything. You're just hoping that somebody comes along and is going to pay more. And they're only going to come along and pay more if they think somebody's going to come along and pay more than them. So not for a value investor like Warren Buffett, certainly not a good idea. His number two guy, Charlie Munger, was more to the point. He just called it rat poison. So I think there's some serious investing issues where it's probably not the best investment.
Thank you. Well, it appears we don't have any more questions.
I see some of the chat here.
Okay, go ahead.
I've got to read the chat. Somebody says it's important to distinguish between cost and price. As the movie The High Cost of Low Price about Walmart, the problem is that the price doesn't represent the actual cost. It can be cheap in dollar terms, yes. For the company to burn something that's polluting, but the cost is actually huge, but the cost is borne by society, not the company. Absolutely, and this is exactly right when we talk about the polluter pays principle. When we don't honor that, when we don't put the cost of pollution on the polluters, we put the cost of pollution on everybody else. And that's certainly what is happening here. Somebody says Reggie would subsidize waste coal. Yes, it would, as does the alternative energy portfolio standard. And it's about 35% worse for climate than normal coal. Yeah, optimistically, it could be worse than that. But it isn't subject to Reggie and would actually be subsidized by it. Yeah, this is one of the things that we certainly are wanting to talk to the Department of Environmental Protection in particular about, is how we do subsidize waste coal combustion through Reggie. Once that is in effect, they will essentially get their allowances for free. And this is for a thing that's not putting energy on the grid or anything like that. We'd certainly like it if that decision is reconsidered, although it does not look like that will in the near term. Those are all the questions I saw. Certainly happy to answer.
Here's
they said, is PennFuture opposed to nuclear power? We have 2 of our nuclear power plants being propped up by crypto mining. I know the Susquehanna Station has crypto. I didn't hear a report of another one having crypto, although I might not have. So please let me know. Please let me know what the other plant is there. PennFuture's view on nuclear is, right now we have 4 nuclear power plants in Pennsylvania. If any of them retire at this point, they are going to be replaced largely by fracked gas. And it's hard to see how we could reach our climate targets with that happening. So we have not been actively calling for these existing plants to be shut down. Although I think there is good reason to believe that nuclear is not a sustainable investment for going forward. Beaver Valley. Yeah. Okay. This new news there. The Beaver Valley plant adding Bitcoin. Yeah, great news. No, yeah, we have not been actively trying to get the existing plants shut down, but I don't think they're a great investment going forward. We certainly would be very, very skeptical of attempts to build new ones, especially new ones subsidized by taxpayers and ratepayers. We think there's a lot better investments to address the climate crisis, but yeah, they have not been the highest priority just because we don't want them replaced by gas plants either.
Thank you, Rob. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon. If there's any more questions, get them in quickly. Otherwise, I'm going to thank everyone for joining us for our Lunch and Learn. We'll be back on March 11th. And Rob, thank you for your time and the information that you shared.
Sure, and I will send around then the slides. Well, I will, I guess, share the slides, and they can certainly be shared. And certainly, if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to email, tweet at Rob Altenburg on Twitter. However you feel like it, or through the PennFuture website, penfuture.org, and I'd be happy to talk about this more.
Thank you.
Thank you.